warm August night in 1990, two young people drove into a quiet wooded area in West Houston. They were only 21 and 22 years old, laughing, talking about the future, and doing something thousands of young couples had done before them. By morning, they were gone. For nearly 36 years, their families carried a question that refused to die. Who took Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson? The case became one of Houston's most haunting mysteries, a double murder with no arrest, no trial, and no clear answer. Detectives chased leads, collected evidence, and watched the years slip away. The city changed, technology changed, entire generations grew up, but the case never disappeared. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a secluded stretch near Enclave Parkway was known locally as Lover's Lane. It was a place where couples parked for privacy, away from the noise of the city. Most nights were uneventful. Teenagers and young adults came and went. Friends knew about it. Police knew about it. It was simply part of local life. And that is what made what happened there so terrifying. Cheryl Henry was 22 years old. Friends and family remembered her as kind, intelligent, and full of energy. She enjoyed spending time with loved ones and was building a life that felt wide open with possibility. To her parents, she was still their daughter, with dreams ahead of her. To her friends, she was the person who could make a room feel lighter. Nothing about that summer suggested her name would one day become part of a cold case file. Her boyfriend, Garland Andy Atkinson, was 21 years old at that time. He was athletic, well-liked, and close to his family. Friends described him as easygoing and dependable. Andy enjoyed sports, spending time outdoors, and being around people he cared about. He and Cheryl had only recently begun dating. Their relationship was new, exciting, and filled with the kind of optimism that comes with being young. They were still getting to know each other. They had no idea they were about to become linked forever in one of Houston's most infamous unsolved crimes. On the evening of August 26, 1990, Cheryl, her sister, and Andy went out to a Houston nightclub called Bayou Mamas. They spent time together like countless young adults do on a summer night, talking, listening to music, and enjoying the evening. Nothing seemed unusual. No one reported an argument. No one reported fear. No one imagined this would be the last time many of their loved ones would see them alive. Later that night, Cheryl and Andy left the club and drove toward the secluded area off Enclave Parkway. It was a decision that seemed completely ordinary, and that is what makes this story so heartbreaking. Hours passed, then something caught attention. The couple's vehicle remained parked for an unusually long time. What began as a routine observation soon turned into a scene that would shock Houston investigators. Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson were found dead near the wooded area. Detectives immediately recognized they were dealing with a major investigation. Yet despite the seriousness of the crime, the person responsible had vanished into the darkness. When detectives arrived at the secluded area off Enclave Parkway during the early hours of August 23, 1990, they knew they weren't looking at an ordinary crime scene. Two young lives had ended in a place where couples came expecting privacy, not danger. The quiet wooded clearing that had been a familiar destination for local young adults was suddenly surrounded by patrol cars, investigators, and crime scene technicians searching for answers. The first few hours of any homicide investigation are often the most critical. Witnesses' memories are freshest. Physical evidence is at its most vulnerable. Every tire track, every footprint, and every overlooked detail has the potential to identify the person responsible. For Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson, investigators would spend those first hours collecting every piece of evidence they could find, hoping it would tell the story that neither victim could. Unfortunately, the answers would prove far more difficult to uncover than anyone expected. Before we go any further, I'd like to comment where you are watching from and if you believe every victim deserves to be remembered and every unanswered question deserves to be explored. Kindly subscribe to the channel. Here, we don't just tell crime stories, we honor lives, examine the evidence, and revisit the cases that history tried to forget. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Now let's return to the investigation. News of the murders spread quickly across West Houston. Family members who had expected Cheryl and Andy to return home instead found themselves speaking with detectives. Friends who had laughed with them just hours earlier struggled to understand how an ordinary night out had ended in tragedy. The murders didn't just affect two families, they unsettled an entire community. Lover's Lane had long been viewed as an isolated but familiar gathering place. Many young people had visited the area over the years without incident. The realization that someone had targeted a couple there left many residents questioning whether the person responsible might still be nearby. As investigators worked behind the scenes, concerns spread throughout Houston. Parents warned their children to avoid secluded locations, and young couples became increasingly cautious about where they spent their evenings. Crime scene investigators carefully documented the area, preserving every piece of evidence that might one day become significant. They determined that Cheryl had been sexually assaulted before her death. Investigators also concluded that Andy had been restrained during the attack. These findings suggested the offender had exercised control over both victims, indicating planning rather than a spontaneous confrontation. While these conclusions helped shape the investigation, they did not immediately point to a suspect. One important discovery, however, would eventually become the cornerstone of the entire case. Investigators recovered biological evidence that contained the offender's DNA. In 1990, DNA analysis was still in its early stages compared with today's standards. Although detectives understood the evidence could be valuable, the technology available at the time was limited. Without a matching profile in available databases or a known suspect for comparison, the DNA could not provide the identity investigators desperately needed. The evidence was preserved carefully, with the hope that future scientific advances might succeed where contemporary technology could not. That decision would prove invaluable decades later. As the investigation expanded, detectives interviewed relatives, friends, co-workers, nightclub patrons, and anyone who might have crossed paths with Cheryl and Andy on their final evening. They reconstructed the couple's movements as carefully as possible. Investigators wanted to know who saw them leave Bayou Mama's. Did anyone follow them? Did anyone else visit the secluded area that night? Could someone have been waiting there? Every answer generated new questions. Some leads appeared promising before reaching dead ends. Others consumed valuable investigative time without producing evidence that could support criminal charges. This is often one of the most difficult realities of homicide investigations. Detectives must examine every credible possibility, even when many ultimately lead nowhere. As months passed, investigators considered whether the murders might be connected to other violent crimes in the Houston area. Several attacks involving young women had occurred around the same period. Detectives compared evidence, reviewed witness statements, and explored whether a single offender could be responsible for multiple crimes. One separate sexual assault investigation became especially important. Although investigators could not immediately identify the attacker in that case either, biological evidence suggested the same unknown individual might be connected to both investigations. It was a significant breakthrough, but only partially. Detectives now had reason to believe they were searching for one unidentified offender instead of two unrelated criminals. Unfortunately, they still didn't know who that offender was. Months became years, years became decades. Detectives retired. New investigators inherited boxes of reports, photographs, laboratory results, interview transcripts, and evidence collected back in 1990. For Cheryl and Andy's families, birthdays came and went, holidays passed. Weddings, graduations, and family gatherings all carried the unmistakable absence of two people who should have been there. Cold cases often create a unique kind of grief. Without an arrest or trial, families are left waiting, not only for justice, but for answers that might explain why their loved ones were taken from them. Yet, despite the passage of time, the Houston Police Department never officially closed the investigation. The evidence remained preserved. The files remained active. And somewhere, detectives believed the person responsible was living an ordinary life while two families continued searching for extraordinary answers. Just when it seemed the investigation had reached a permanent standstill, science began to change. Advances in DNA technology would breathe new life into evidence that had been sitting quietly in storage for decades. A second case, once thought unrelated, would suddenly become the key to unlocking one of Houston's oldest murder mysteries. For almost 6 decades, the evidence sat quietly inside a secure property room. It didn't speak, it didn't point to a name. It didn't tell detectives where to look next. But unlike memories, physical evidence doesn't fade with time. Sometimes it simply waits for science to catch up. For Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson, that wait would last nearly 36 years. Cold cases are often misunderstood. Many people imagine that once a case goes cold, detectives stop working on it. In reality, a cold case simply means there are no active leads, not that investigators have stopped caring. Inside the Houston Police Department's cold case unit, Cheryl and Andy's file remained one of the department's most significant unsolved homicide investigations. Over the years, new detectives approached the case with fresh eyes. They reread thousands of pages of reports, re-examined photographs, reviewed forensic evidence, and questioned whether modern investigative techniques could uncover something their predecessors simply didn't have the tools to find. The goal wasn't to prove the earlier investigators had missed something. It was to ask whether technology had finally become good enough to answer questions that 1990 science could not. In the early 1990s, DNA testing was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations. It could establish whether biological evidence came from the same unknown person, but identifying that person was much harder. National DNA databases were still developing, and many offenders had never submitted DNA samples because they had never been convicted of qualifying crimes. As the years passed, forensic science advanced dramatically. Laboratories became capable of analyzing much smaller samples with greater accuracy. Profiles that once produced only limited information could now reveal far more. Investigators revisited the biological evidence collected in Cheryl and Andy's case using these improved techniques. The results confirmed something detectives had long suspected. The DNA recovered from the murder scene belonged to the same unknown individual connected to another violent crime investigated in Houston around the same period. For the first time, investigators knew with confidence that they were not looking at isolated events. They were searching for one man. The linked investigation involved a woman who had survived a sexual assault in 1990. Unlike Cheryl and Andy, she was able to provide investigators with valuable information about her attacker. She described his appearance, his behavior, and the terrifying encounter that changed her life forever. Years later, forensic testing established that the DNA from her case matched the DNA recovered during the Lover's Lane investigation. That connection transformed the entire investigation. Instead of relying solely on physical evidence, detectives now had a surviving witness whose account helped build a clearer picture of the unknown offender. Although she could not identify him by name, her experience added important context to the forensic evidence. Every confirmed detail narrowed the search. By the mid-2020s, renewed forensic work and investigative review generated fresh momentum. Detectives carefully re-examined historical records, compared evidence across multiple investigations, and followed information that earlier generations of investigators had been unable to fully develop. This wasn't one dramatic moment where a computer instantly revealed a suspect. It was the result of countless hours spent reviewing decades-old files, verifying information, and combining modern forensic science with traditional detective work. Eventually, investigators focused on one individual. His name was Floyd William Parrott. At the time of the murders, he had lived in the Houston area. As detectives dug deeper, they found information that warranted further investigation and comparison with the evidence preserved since 1990. Piece by piece, the puzzle that had remained incomplete for nearly 36 years began to fit together. Identifying a suspect is only part of a homicide investigation. Detectives must gather enough reliable evidence to support criminal charges beyond mere suspicion. Investigators worked closely with forensic experts, prosecutors, and the Harris County District Attorney's Office to ensure every step of the investigation met legal standards. Evidence collected decades earlier was reviewed alongside newer forensic findings. Witness statements were revisited. Historical records were verified. Every conclusion had to be supported by evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. After years of work, investigators believed they had reached that point. They were finally prepared to ask prosecutors to move forward. For Cheryl and Andy's families, it was the closest they had come to answers since that summer night in 1990. But one final step remained. The man detectives believed was responsible no longer lived in Texas. finding him and bringing him back to Houston would become the next chapter in one of the city's longest-running murder investigations. But what investigators discovered next would shock an entire community. Before we continue, if you believe every victim deserves to have their story remembered, consider subscribing and give this video a like to help spread awareness and social safety. In March 2026, nearly 36 years after Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson lost their lives, investigators knocked on a door hundreds of miles from Houston. What happened next stunned the nation. A man in Nebraska would soon face accusations connected to one of Texas' most enduring cold cases, bringing decades of unanswered questions to the threshold of justice. For the families of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson, nearly 36 years had passed without an arrest. Birthdays came and went. Parents grew older. Friends built families of their own. The investigation had survived changes in police leadership, advances in forensic science, and the passage of an entire generation. Then, in the spring of 2026, everything changed. A case that many once believed would never be solved suddenly made national headlines. In March 2026, investigators traveled far from the wooded streets of West Houston. Their destination was Lincoln, Nebraska, where the man they believed was responsible for the 1990 murders had been living. For decades, the suspect had remained outside the public spotlight. While detectives continued reviewing evidence in Texas, life had moved on around him. But investigators had not forgotten. Working together, the Houston Police Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Harris County District Attorney's Office coordinated the operation that had taken years to prepare. When law enforcement officers arrived, they arrested Floyd William Parrott, who was 64 years old at the time. For the first time since August 1990, someone was in custody in connection with Cheryl and Andy's deaths. The announcement reverberated across Houston. When Houston police publicly announced the arrest, it marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the legal process. Investigators explained that the arrest was the product of decades of persistence, preserved evidence, and advances in forensic science. Officials emphasized that the investigation had never truly stopped. Even when public attention faded, detectives continued to revisit the evidence whenever new technology or new information became available. The arrest also highlighted the importance of properly preserving forensic evidence. Had that evidence not been carefully maintained in 1990, the breakthroughs that came decades later might never have been possible. For many investigators, both retired and active, the announcement was deeply emotional. Some of the detectives who had worked the original investigation were finally seeing progress they had hoped for throughout their careers. After reviewing the evidence presented by investigators, the Harris County District Attorney's Office filed a charge of capital murder. Under Texas law, capital murder is reserved for specific categories of homicide defined by statute, including certain cases involving multiple victims. A criminal charge is an accusation, not a conviction. At this stage, prosecutors believed they had sufficient evidence to present the case in court, while the defendant remained legally presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. This distinction is one of the cornerstones of the American criminal justice system. The next steps would normally include extradition proceedings, pretrial hearings, disclosure of evidence, and eventually a trial where both the prosecution and the defense would have the opportunity to present their cases before a judge or jury. For Cheryl and Andy's loved ones, that trial represented something they had waited decades to witness. The arrest brought emotions that were difficult to describe: relief, gratitude, disbelief. For years, Cheryl's and Andy's families had lived with unanswered questions. They had attended memorials, spoken with detectives, and wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable. Now, investigators were telling them they had identified a suspect. Family members publicly thanked the Houston Police Department, the FBI, forensic specialists, and prosecutors who had refused to abandon the case. Their appreciation reflected not only the arrest itself, but also the years of dedication that made it possible. Still, many understood that an arrest was only one step in a much longer legal journey. Justice in the courtroom had yet to begin. As extradition proceedings moved forward, prosecutors prepared for what would likely become one of the most closely watched cold case trials in Texas. Their task would be substantial. They would need to explain forensic evidence collected decades earlier, demonstrate the reliability of modern DNA analysis, and present witness testimony that had survived the passage of time. The defense, in turn, would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's evidence and arguments. Such cases often involve detailed legal debates over forensic procedures, evidence preservation, and witness credibility. Everyone anticipated that the courtroom would finally become the place where the evidence was tested in full view of the public. But events took an unexpected turn before that process could begin. Only weeks after the arrest, news emerged that changed the course of the case. Before Floyd William Parrott could be extradited to Texas to face the capital murder charge, authorities in Nebraska reported that he had died while in custody. His death meant the criminal prosecution could not continue. There would be no jury selection, no opening statements, no witnesses called to testify, no verdict delivered in a courtroom. For the families, the news brought another wave of complex emotions. After waiting nearly 36 years for the legal process to begin, it had come to an abrupt end before the evidence could be presented at trial. How does the justice system respond when a criminal case ends before trial? What did investigators believe the evidence showed, and how did Cheryl and Andy's families react to learning that there would never be a courtroom verdict? For nearly 36 years, Cheryl Henry's and Andy Atkinson's families imagined one day sitting inside a courtroom. They imagined hearing prosecutors explain the evidence. They imagined listening as witnesses testified, and perhaps most of all, they imagined finally hearing a verdict. Instead, before the legal process could truly begin, everything came to an unexpected halt. After Floyd William Parrott's arrest in Nebraska in March 2026, the next legal step was expected to be extradition to Harris County, Texas. Once returned to Texas, he would have appeared before the court, where prosecutors would formally pursue the capital murder charge. Under the U.S. legal system, that process is essential. Criminal charges are allegations that must be tested in court, and every defendant is entitled to due process, including the opportunity to challenge the evidence presented against them. But those proceedings never began. Authorities in Nebraska announced that Parrott had died while in custody before extradition could take place. Because the defendant was deceased, the criminal prosecution ended as a matter of law. Without a living defendant, there could be no criminal trial, no presentation of evidence before a jury, and no verdict. The capital murder charge was never adjudicated in court. According to Houston police and prosecutors, decades of investigative work, advances in forensic science, and preserved biological evidence had led them to seek the capital murder charge. That evidence formed the basis for the arrest. However, because the case never proceeded to trial, the evidence was never subjected to the full adversarial process that is central to the American justice system. In any criminal case, a trial allows prosecutors to present evidence, the defense to challenge it, and a judge or jury to determine whether guilt has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Since that process never occurred here, there was no judicial finding of guilt or innocence. For many observers, this distinction is important. The arrest represented a significant investigative milestone, but it was not the same as a criminal conviction. For Cheryl's and Andy's loved ones, the emotions were deeply complicated. There was gratitude. After decades of uncertainty, investigators had finally identified the man they believed was responsible for taking Cheryl and Andy's lives. The families publicly thanked the Houston Police Department, the FBI, forensic scientists, and the Harris County District Attorney's Office for refusing to let the case fade into history. Many of the detectives who worked the original investigation had retired long before the arrest. Others had inherited the case years later, determined to continue where previous investigators left off. The families recognized that countless people had contributed to reaching that point. But alongside that gratitude was disappointment. The courtroom proceedings they had waited decades to witness would never happen. Questions they hoped would be answered through testimony would remain unanswered. There would be no cross-examination, no explanation from the accused, no jury deliberation, no formal verdict. That reality left a sense of unfinished justice. Although the prosecution ended prematurely, investigators emphasized that the case still carried important lessons. The successful identification of a suspect nearly 36 years later demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving evidence. In 1990, investigators could not have predicted how dramatically forensic science would evolve. Yet, because the evidence was carefully collected, documented, and preserved, future generations of detectives were able to revisit it using technologies that did not exist when the crime occurred. Cold case investigators across the United States often describe evidence as a message from the past. Sometimes that message cannot be fully understood until years or even decades later. The Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson investigation became one more example of how persistence, scientific progress, and careful police work can breathe new life into cases once thought unsolvable. As public attention returned to the case in 2026, many people reflected on something easily lost amid discussions of DNA, court filings, and investigative milestones. At the heart of this story were two young people. Cheryl Henry was a daughter, a sister, and a friend whose future was cut tragically short. Andy Atkinson was a son, a friend, and a young man remembered for his easygoing personality and the life he was only beginning to build. Their names became associated with one of Houston's longest-running cold cases, but they were far more than victims in a criminal investigation. They were loved, and for nearly 36 years, those who loved them refused to stop hoping that someone would one day uncover the truth. The investigation may have reached its legal conclusion, but its broader impact continues to resonate. Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson's names were spoken alongside one phrase more than any other: cold case. It was a label that suggested time had stood still. But behind that label were detectives who kept working, families who never stopped hoping, and evidence that quietly waited for the day science could finally reveal what it had been holding all along. While the courtroom chapter never unfolded as many expected, the investigation itself left behind lessons that extend far beyond one case. When people hear the word justice, they often imagine a courtroom. They picture a jury, a verdict, and a sentence. But criminal investigations don't always end that way. In this case, investigators reached the point where they believed they had identified the person responsible and filed criminal charges. Yet because the suspect died before trial, the legal process ended without a judicial determination of guilt. For Cheryl's and Andy's families, that meant there would never be the public hearing they had waited decades to witness. Even so, many family members expressed appreciation that investigators never gave up. After years of unanswered questions, they finally received information that investigators believed explained what had happened to their loved ones. It wasn't the ending they had hoped for, but it was an ending that brought more answers than they had for most of their lives. One of the most remarkable aspects of this case is not simply that it was investigated for decades. It's that every generation of investigators treated it as though it still mattered. The detectives who first responded in 1990 carefully documented the crime scene. The forensic specialists preserved biological evidence despite the technological limitations of the time. Years later, new investigators reopened old files, re-examined overlooked details, and applied scientific methods that had not yet been invented when Cheryl and Andy were killed. Each group built upon the work of those who came before. No single detective solved this case alone. It became a relay race spanning decades, with each investigator carrying the baton a little farther until the evidence pointed where it needed to go. That kind of persistence is one reason many cold cases continue to be solved long after the crimes themselves. Cases like this naturally raise questions about personal safety. While no precaution can eliminate every risk and responsibility always rests with the offender, not the victim, there are practical habits that can improve personal safety in many situations. If you're meeting friends or spending time with someone, consider letting a trusted person know where you'll be and when you expect to return. If plans change unexpectedly, sending a quick update to a family member or close friend can make it easier for others to know where to begin if something goes wrong. When choosing a place to spend time, be mindful of your surroundings. Locations that are isolated or have limited visibility may reduce the chances that someone nearby can notice if help is needed. Trust your instincts. If a place or situation suddenly feels unsafe, it's okay to leave even if you can't immediately explain why. These habits are not guarantees, nor should they ever be viewed as placing responsibility on victims. Rather, they are practical steps that may help reduce risk in everyday life. Some people wonder why investigators continue working on crimes that happened decades ago. The answer is simple. Families never stop missing the people they lost. The passage of time doesn't erase grief. Birthdays still arrive. Holiday traditions still remind loved ones of who should be sitting at the table. Photographs don't stop being meaningful simply because they've grown older. For investigators, solving a cold case is about more than identifying a suspect. It's about honoring victims by continuing to search for the truth, no matter how much time has passed. Every breakthrough sends a message to families across the country that their loved ones have not been forgotten. Before this story became known as the Lover's Lane murders, it was simply the story of two young people enjoying an evening together. Cheryl Henry was 22 years old. Andy Atkinson was 21. They had plans, families who loved them, and futures that stretched far beyond that August night. Although their lives ended far too soon, the memories shared by those who knew them continue to define who they were far more than the circumstances of their deaths. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. True crime should never be about elevating the person accused of committing the crime. It should be about remembering the lives that were changed forever and recognizing the extraordinary efforts of those who dedicate themselves to seeking the truth. The story of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson reminds us that justice is not always straightforward, and it does not always arrive in the way families hope. Yet it also reminds us of something equally powerful. Evidence can endure, science can evolve. Investigators can remain committed across generations, and families, despite unimaginable loss, can continue to hope. If this case resonates with you, take a moment to remember Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson not only as victims of a tragic crime, but as two young people whose lives mattered. Their story continues to encourage advances in forensic investigation, inspire the work of cold case detectives, and remind us that every unanswered question deserves to be pursued with diligence, compassion, and respect. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories that focus on verified facts, respectful storytelling, and the ongoing pursuit of justice. Until next time, stay aware, look out for your loved ones, and never underestimate the importance of remembering those whose voices can no longer speak for themselves. Here is another intriguing discovery about a killer that lived free for decades before science caught up on his trail.